Juneteenth is significant because I think in the context of the history that's taught, there's an illusion that slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation.
Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Today is the official federal holiday of Juneteenth, National Independence Day. It's been called Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, and Black Independence Day. It commemorates June 19, 1865, when Union Army troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, to issue General Order No. 3, which informed all the people of Texas that all enslaved people are now free. The order came more than 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Even though Lincoln had declared all enslaved people free on paper, that wasn't the case in practice. President Biden signed Juneteenth, National Independence Day, into legislation 2 years ago, establishing the first federal holiday since Martin Luther King Day in 1983. So what does Juneteenth mean as our country continues to try to create a more perfect union? In a moment, we'll hear from a prominent scholar at the University of Vermont. But first, here's Civil War historian Howard Coffin to discuss President Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued on New Year's Day, 1863.
On the way to Washington to become president, he takes this long train trip from Springfield. He stops at, a dozen cities. And everywhere he goes, he speaks. And obviously he's been cautioned by people like Seward, don't talk about slavery. And he doesn't until he gets to Independence Hall near the end of the trip in Philadelphia. And he raises the flag there, there's a huge crowd, and he can't contain himself. What he talks about is the Declaration of Independence. And he says what's kept the country together for so long is not getting free from England. It's the promise that eventually this country will bring about the lifting of the weight from all men in all the world. He's talking about slavery. And he says that that is the principle that he wants to use to guide his governing. And if he can't do that, he says, he would just as soon be assassinated right on the spot. Now, take away the assassination talk, which is strange, but what he's saying here is just about what he says 2 years later at Gettysburg. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So it's been in his mind a long, long time.
How is the war going when Lincoln tells his cabinet he's going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation?
In the spring and early summer of 1862, the Union has suffered a horrible defeat in the Peninsula Campaign outside Richmond. McClellan has been beaten by Robert E. Lee. Lincoln, right after this, tells two members of the cabinet, Welles and Seward, that he's planning to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. On the 22nd of July, 10 days later, he tells the whole cabinet what he's going to do. Seward says, wait a minute, we can't do it now. If we do it now, it's going to look like weakness. It's going to look like we're trying to cover up the defeat. We need to wait until we have a military victory. And Lincoln, after some discussion, agrees. There's quite a wait. In August, there's a great defeat at Second Bull Run. But in September, on the 17th, comes Antietam. And that is a narrow Union victory. Lee's invasion of the North is turned back.
What's the reaction in Vermont? What Emancipation Proclamation is issued? Vermont had banned slavery since its inception, 1777. What's the reaction up here and in the Union overall?
Those who hated slavery, the Vermont abolitionists, thought it was a great step forward. Listen to rather prominent abolitionist Rufus Kingsley from Fletcher, who's serving in the 8th Vermont Regiment. He writes in his diary, Thank God, the word has at last been spoken. Light begins to break through. Let the sons of earth rejoice. Sing praise to liberty. Let tyranny die. Lift every voice and sing.
Juneteenth has long been celebrated in African American communities, but it was just 2 years ago that the day was commemorated as a national holiday for the first time. Across the Fence's Keith Silva sat down with a longtime member of the University of Vermont's community to discuss the significance of this national holiday.
Juneteenth is significant because I think in the context of the history that's taught, there's an illusion that slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. And Juneteenth is significant because it actually does mark the, at least, end of formal slavery. There was still sharecropping, there was still indentured servitude in certain ways, but Juneteenth marks, at least in US history, the formal end in the then United States of slavery, not the Emancipation Proclamation. And I think that's a significant and important piece.
And what about for you personally?
To be honest, as a family, we didn't have any place to celebrate it until we actually came to Vermont. So Vermont's the first place I've been where there have actually been, at least in the Burlington area, activities to go to. I was aware of it, but we were talking about education. It was certainly nothing I got in K-12. It wasn't until graduate school that I actually became aware of the disconnect between the idea that the emancipation freed all the slaves and Juneteenth. For me, it wasn't something that my family had gotten in their own education, and so I didn't really find out about it until I was much older.
How does Juneteenth inform the university when most of the students are away?
Well, to be fair, it's not that there's no students. We have an active summer program. We have an active continuing and distance ed program. Just because we don't have classes, all of our students aren't gone. And so it's an opportunity for them. Our faculty and staff live here. It's an opportunity for them and their school-age children who are K-12 to attend and involve. So I think that it directly impacts the campus, not as much as if all 12,000 students were on campus, but certainly it involves the campus community writ large.
Do you think, as a scholar, as a teacher, that was George Floyd that spark? Why now, Sherwood?
I would certainly say that Black Lives Matter and George Floyd were a factor, but not the only factor. Certainly, sadly, you saw a response to Confederate monuments and states taking down Confederate flags as a result of the church shootings, right? So change is inevitable. When I was growing up, there was no Martin Luther King Day, right? So what sparked there to be a Martin Luther King Day? It's not just one thing, though certainly I think that the Black Lives Matters movement and, all right, the only reason I think George Floyd is significant is this. You go back to the civil rights movement. The thing that motivated people was suddenly on the news, they saw unarmed people being attacked with fire hoses and dogs. Right. You could not then argue that there is justice and equity for all, right? So I think what happened was, at least for me, I can't speak for anybody else, there's a visceral reaction to watching somebody utterly non-pulsed, kneeling on somebody's throat for almost 10 minutes while people are yelling and screaming at them that the person needs help. When the person is saying they can't breathe, you have some reaction to that, right? So I think that these are cumulative events and not, it would be great if there was just the one thing that flicked the switch. I think these are cumulative events and you build up enough inertia to sort of move the arc of history, as Martin Luther King used to say, in a certain direction, right? And sadly, you get backlash from it as well. So it's not as simple as, oh great, now we've got this holiday. Well, I've run into situations where it seems as if these are, all right, Juneteenth or MLK Day. These are black African American holidays. In my view, first of all, it's great that they're celebrating my people's history, but either these are US holidays just like everything else, or you need to start saying that Washington's birthday is a white holiday, right? Awareness of the histories of the people that make up this country are important to all of us, not just the group that happens to be celebrating the holiday on that day. I think national holidays are a statement about what the nation sees as relevant and important. Whether people participate or not is a whole other issue. But the fact that there is a national holiday says that this is seen as significant for the nation. I think that's important. It's not sufficient, but I think that that's important. Whether you participate in them or, which I think is good, but we're always picking and choosing what we participate in, so that's natural and normal at some level. But I think the piece for me where the holidays kick in, going back to our first start in this conversation, is if it's a national holiday, then one would expect that it was discussed in school. If it's not a national holiday, maybe, maybe not. But if it's a national holiday and you have students leaving a school system and not knowing what the significance of the holiday is, to me, as an educator, that's inherently problematic.
Our thanks to Dr. Sherwood Smith for speaking with us about the significance of Juneteenth, which, as we've noted, occurred more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and 2 months after the end of the Civil War. Here's Vermont historian Howard Coffin joining Across the Fence associate producer Keith Silva in Petersburg, Virginia, for the beginning of the end of the war.
After 9 bloody months of trying, the Confederate defenses at Petersburg are finally broken by a farm boy from Windham, Vermont, Charles Gould. It is one of the Civil War's great moments. And today, a 424-acre battlefield park, Pamplin Park, preserves the site. 14,000 men coming through that field, and up in the front was Charles Gould and his company, and somebody hollered behind him, "Bear to the left." And he thought it meant for the whole formation to go that way, but as it turns out, Gould's company were the only men who started off in the direction toward that creek. And they crossed that creek and came up against the Confederate earthworks all by themselves. What to do? So Gould comes over the top and down into these trenches, and the North Carolinians light into him. He's sabred in the head, he's sabred in the face, he's bayoneted in the side. A comrade finally drags him back up over the lip, but now Union troops are pouring over these earthworks to the left and right of us, and Lee's line is broken, and Charles Gould was the first to break it. And Lee will now have no choice but to order Petersburg abandoned, and then Richmond as well. Charles Gould is taken to a Union hospital, and he will survive to live a rather long life back in Vermont. As for Lee's soldiers, they begin a long march to the west, following the Appomattox River, headed they know not where, trying to link up with another Confederate army. Along that line of march is a little country town called Appomattox Courthouse. Robert E. Lee's once great Army of Northern Virginia was down to 50,000 men when it left Petersburg. It moved west on country roads through this gentle Virginia countryside, hoping to meet up with Joseph Johnston's army coming up from North Carolina. The first battle of Lee's retreat west happened here at Namazie Church. There was a brisk fight here, the church miraculously undamaged, and then Lee kept moving to the west. A meeting took place here after the battle. William Wells was here, George Armstrong Custer, commanding his division, came up, and then Phil Sheridan himself was here, commanding all the Union cavalry. They met briefly, and Sheridan told them to ride hard. Let's cut off Lee's retreat. This is the village green in Amelia Courthouse, Virginia, a railroad town, as you can hear. This was an important place in Lee's retreat plans. At the railroad tracks, there were to be supply trains. His men were starving. But they had to wait here a day because the trains were late. And by the time the trains arrived and Lee fed his men, the Union infantry, not just the cavalry, was right on his heels. Lee's retreat continued until April 6, when part of his army was cut off just after it had crossed Little Sailor's Creek. And they'd moved up onto that high ground that you can see. But they were cut off by Sheridan's cavalry and had to make a stand on that hill. Up into this area came the big 6th Corps of the Army of the Potomac that included the Vermont Brigade. The Vermont Brigade went into line of battle around this house, but did not fight that day, although the 2nd Vermont Regiment advanced a ways. The Vermonters who did fight that day, serving under General Truax, the 10th Vermont Regiment. And the 10th Vermont advanced behind us down into that valley and attacked up that far hill. The results were disastrous for Robert E. Lee. On they came under fire from the Confederates on the heights above. They waded this creek, Little Sailor's Creek, and surged uphill. Later in the day, the 2nd Vermont Regiment would fire a few shots, exchanging fire with pickets further down the creek. But this was the last infantry action of the Civil War for the Vermonters. The great history of Vermont infantry in the Civil War that included the fighting at Gettysburg and Lee's Mill, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cedar Creek, Winchester, and of course Petersburg, came to an end here. The Vermonters didn't know it that day, April 6, but their fighting as foot soldiers was at an end. The Confederate troops arranged on this high ground never had a chance. Artillery fire rained in from the area of the Hillsman House. Line on line on line of Yankee soldiers advanced up this high ground. Cavalry, Union cavalry, came in from the east, and soon the Confederates were surrounded and surrendered in droves. 8,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms up here above Little Sailor's Creek. Among them, the famous Confederate general Richard Ewell, Baldy Ewell. Some said he was in tears, seated on the ground when he gave up. His Civil War was over. From the high ground in this area, Robert E. Lee got a distant view of the fighting at Little Sailor's Creek. He turned to an aide and said, "My God, is my army dissolving?" A series of messages was about to be exchanged between Lee and Grant concerning the surrendering of the Army of Northern Virginia. The morning of April 9th, John B. Gordon received permission from Robert E. Lee to make one try at breaking through the Union cavalry, which was blocking the route west. Right in this area where this fence is, Gordon's men moved forward against a line of Union cavalry up along that tree line. In that line, the 1st Vermont Cavalry under William Wells of Waterbury. Firing began, and then the cavalry began to ride off to the right. Their moving revealed what was behind them. Ranks of thousands on thousands of blue-clad soldiers of the Army of the James. Gordon saw that, and it was too much. And he sent word back to Lee, "We cannot break through." But those cavalrymen were under the command of one of the fightingest generals ever, George Armstrong Custer, and he ordered an attack. When suddenly a blue-clad officer shouted orders to lower your rifles. You'll never have to use them again in this war. The charge was stopped. The fighting ended. A couple of miles short of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's ride to the west ended. He found out that the way was blocked up ahead, and so he pitched his headquarters tent right here. Spent a rather quiet night of April 8th and 9th. In the morning, General Edward Porter Alexander came to him with a suggestion that maybe he should order his men to take to the hills and wage guerrilla warfare. "No," said Lee, "that would ruin the country." And he certainly was right. It was not long after noon that word came that he should ride up into the village to meet General Grant to discuss surrender. Lee rode up on his big war horse Traveler coming from this direction, Grant coming in on Cincinnati from this direction, riding into the courtyard and climbing the stairs into the house to meet in the parlor. April 9th, 1865, the home of Wilmer McLean at Appomattox Courthouse. McLean, of course, had moved from Manassas after the first battle of Bull Run down here to Southern Virginia to get away from the war. And suddenly it's the centerpiece of the war, his home. General Lee was waiting in his best dressed uniform when Ulysses Grant arrived. There was a time of informal chatter as Grant well remembered Lee from the Mexican War. Lee may not have remembered him so well. It was Lee who finally called attention to the matter at hand, which was the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. About an hour and a half of talk and writing. At the end, Lee asked for an addition to the terms that the men be able to take their horses with them, his men, for the spring planting, and Grant agreed. Grant reflected on the day, and he remembered that on looking at Lee, he was unable to determine in any way what seemed to be on Lee's mind. What was he thinking? He himself, Grant, said that he felt no jubilation at the triumph over a foe that had fought so long and so well, but he added, even though that cause for which they fought was one of the worst for which people ever fought.